right, so we are just going to do a quick overview of ratios and rates, and then look at, with rates, what we mean by a unit rate and how we can use unit rates to make a comparison. Okay, so a ratio is simply a comparison of two quantities. I have an example there of some students there, so you can use a ratio to compare the number of students who have cell phones to the number of students who don't have cell phones in that picture. So if we look at the picture, we have got 3 students there with cell phones and 2 without cell phones. So if I wanted to just write that as a ratio, as a comparison mathematically, there's really 3 ways I can do that. Okay, so one way I could do that is, get this over here, there we go, is just with a colon. So I can write it as, in this case, 3 colon 2. I could write it as a fraction, or I could write it with the word 2. Okay, a couple things related to that. All 3 of those cases we would pronounce those as 3 to 2, just like we have it written here. Okay, so with the colon, I'd read that as 3 to 2. With the fraction, I read it as 3 to 2. We don't read the fraction as 3 halves. Even though we write it as a fraction, it doesn't kind of represent the same thing. So we'll look a little bit more at that here in a second. But again, we can write it 3 different ways. All 3 are acceptable. All 3 of those, we had to pronounce them as 3 to 2. Just make sure when you guys write a ratio, the order matters, right? 3 to 2 and 2 to 3 are different. So we want to make sure we pay attention to the words and what the ratio, the order of the ratio is asking us to write. So now again, we can let me scroll here. Write a ratio as a fraction, but it means just something a little different. So let's look at another example here. All right, I've got some jelly beans there. It says Julio opened a small bag of jelly beans and counted them. There were 2 green jelly beans and 4 yellow jelly beans. What's the ratio of green jelly beans to yellow jelly beans? Okay, so we've got our green ones there. Stop doing that. Come on, pen. There we go. So I've got a green jelly bean and another green jelly bean. Okay, so we have 2 green jelly beans. And if I count there, I have 4 yellow jelly beans. All right, so I'm going to write that as 2 to 4. Now, a couple things. We can simplify ratios just like fractions, so I'd simplify that down. Those are both divisible by 2, so 1 to 2. Okay. Again, a ratio is written as a fraction, but it doesn't mean the same thing, right? If that was a fraction, that's half, right? And we'd say that the ratio is half of it, right? Half of the jelly beans are green. Okay, in this case, it means 1 to 2. So for every 1 green jelly bean in this case, there's 2 red jelly beans. So it has a slightly different meaning than a fraction. So even though we write it in fraction form, that's why we don't want to say the ratio is 1/2. We want to say it's 1 to 2 because it's a comparison. Now with a rate, right? Rate's a specific type of ratio. Typically, we deal with rates when we're talking about different measuring units. So like I might be making using a recipe where the ratio of flour to sugar is 3 cups of flour to 2 teaspoons of sugar, right? The measuring unit's important in that, okay? I can't do 3 cups of flour to 2 cups of sugar or 3 teaspoons to 2 teaspoons. So when the labels are important, that's where we call it a rate. It's essentially the same as a ratio. It's just we have labels with a rate where a ratio we don't, okay? So you might go on a trip, and that trip you travel 300 miles and you use 15 gallons of gas. So I could write that as a rate, right? And I have to have those labels in there because we got to know what we're talking about, okay? 300 miles, 15 gallons is a lot different than, let's say, 300 kilometers and 15 gallons. Those are different distances, so got to have the labels. Now, what we typically want to do with a rate then is we want to find what's called a unit rate. So a unit rate is a rate that has a denominator of 1. Right, so right now my denominator in my fraction is 15. I want to turn it into 1, okay? And if you can just remember the word per, when we see that word per, that's when we divide, right? So if I'm trying, in this case, to figure out how many miles per 1 gallon, all I need to do is take my miles divided by my gallons. The unit rate tells you the order of division. So if you're not quite sure, do I do 300 divided by 15? Do I do 15 divided by 300? Think about the unit rate that you're trying to find here. In this case, you're trying to find miles per gallon. So we want to take miles divided by gallons, right? On my problem here, I do 300 divided by 15, and that would give me 20. And again, we want to have a label so we know what our measuring unit is, what we're talking about here. So 20 miles per gallon. Okay, and you'll see it written a lot with the word per. You could write it as a fraction. You could write it with a colon. Okay, a bunch of different things. Sometimes they have abbreviations, miles per hour. You might see written as MPH, for example. Okay, but that is a unit rate. A unit rate means per one thing. Per one thing. All right, and we can use unit rates to help us make comparisons. Okay, so let's look at an example here. I've got did a little Google search for some different Cheerios and their off brands, and these are from a local big box store here. So you can see we got some different varieties, we've got some different sizes, and we've got some different prices. So it's really hard to kind of make a comparison of what the best deal is because there's so many different variables going on. You've got different amounts, but those different amounts are also different sizes. Okay, so we can use a unit rate to help us make that comparison, right? So in this case, and typically with most things in this situation, we're going to find the unit cost. So that's kind of a fairly typical unit rate that you'll find. So unit cost is how much you pay per whatever your measuring unit is. In this case, our measuring unit's ounces, right? So I'm going to figure out what's the cost per ounce. Okay, and if you're ever stuck thinking, well, which way do I divide? Do I do the 21.6 divided by the 3.77 in this case? Okay, always kind of go back to that. What's the unit rate I'm trying to find, right? And that'll tell you the order and division. Cost per ounce, I'm doing the cost divided by the ounces, okay? So I've got my first one there, the Great Value Honey Nut Spins Oat Cereal, 21.6 ounces for $3.77. So I'm going to calculate the cost per ounce on that one, okay? So I'm going to take the 377 divided by 21.6, right? And that is not a mental math problem for me, so I am going to use a calculator. 377 divided by 21.6, and that gets me to be about, I'm going to round that up to about 17.5 cents. Okay, you might have to round differently depending on the numbers, but I'm gonna go 3 decimal places here, so 0.175 when I round it. Okay. So that's my first one. Okay, if I look at my multi-meal cereal Honey Nut Scooters, those cost more, but you get more cereal. So those are $7.13 for 39 ounces. So I'm going to take my cost, so $7.13, and I'm going to divide it by my measuring unit of 39 ounces. So that one is about 18.3 cents per ounce. Sounds a little bit more expensive than the Honey Nut Spins. And then the Honey Nut Cheerios, the name brand ones there, those are $3.47 for 17 ounces. So I'm going to calculate that unit cost. So $3.47 is my cost divided by my measuring unit of 17 ounces. And that comes out to be about 20.4 cents. Okay. And my computer calculator is kind of nice because I can compare all three right on the screen. So we can see that that one is going to be, oops, I forgot it was 20.4. Okay. So that one's going to be our most expensive, right? So again, when we talk about best deal, you want the cheapest amount per measuring unit per ounce in this case. So in this case, my Honey Nut Spins is the cheapest, followed by the Honey Nut Scooters, and then finally the name brand variety is my most expensive. Okay, so we can use unit costs and unit rates to help us make different comparisons in this case to be a little bit smarter shopper.